There are crimes so old, so soaked in shadow and whispers, that time itself seems reluctant to touch them. They live in the cracks of cities, in yellowing newspapers and the faint memories of ghosts who still linger in locked rooms. The story of Elma Sands is one of these. It begins with a girl who believed in love, who believed in promises, and ends, if it ends at all, with a trial, and a silence that has never truly lifted. In the closing days of 1799, as New York braced against a brutal winter and the streets filled with frost and smoke, Elma Sands was seen walking through the city's half-lit streets with a man said to be her suitor. She was never seen alive again. When her body was found at the bottom of a well, frozen, bruised, and drowned, suspicion turned quickly to the young carpenter who had been with her last. What followed was a trial like no other, a duel of power, prestige, and persuasion, where two of America's most famous men stood not for the girl who died, but for the man accused of killing her. Yet the question remains, what truly happened on that night? And who, among the living, ever knew the truth, before New York's cold swallowed her up? Elma Sands had lived in hills that turned golden in autumn and white in silence. She had been born in 1778, in the village of Cornwall, New York, in a house made of wood that creaked when it rained and smelled of wood smoke and yeast. Her family, Quakers by faith and farmers by trade, were known for honesty and modesty, those old values that curled like smoke through early American life. There was nothing remarkable about Elma's childhood, but even the quietest girls sometimes carry dreams so large they cannot speak them aloud. She was the youngest of several siblings, most of them married off or lost to sickness by the time she was a young teenager. Her father had died when she was small, and her mother, a silent woman with tired hands, had never quite recovered from the long war that had consumed the colony before Elma was old enough to understand what independence meant. But the girl had eyes like lit glass and a stubborn tilt to her chin. She could sew, she could read, and when she laughed, her cousin Catherine used to say, it sounded like she wasn't from there at all. Her education was practical, as most girls were, but her imagination stretched beyond the hem of her apron. She read what she could find, books passed from neighbor to neighbor, newspapers weeks old, sometimes letters that weren't hers. She heard, more than once, that women ought to marry early, and marry well, but she didn't believe in marrying just to leave the house. She believed, if anything, in the idea that love might be real, might be chosen. At 17, she left her village for Albany, where she worked briefly in a home as a domestic companion. When that fell apart, why, no one was sure, she went back, for a time, to her brother's farm, and it was there that Catherine Ring found her. Catherine had always liked Elma's spirit, and the idea of the two cousins living in New York City together seemed exciting, even safe. Catherine was older, more practical, and already lodged at a quiet boarding house in Greenwich Street, where the rules were clear and the landlady honest. So Elma came to the city in early 1799 with a trunk of clothes, a small purse of coins, and a cautious sense of hope. New York, then, was bustling, barely rebuilt after fire and fever, but full of promise. The streets were muddy, the buildings half-finished. But Elma looked past that. She found small sewing work. She helped Mrs. Ring. She read in the afternoons. And when she met Levi Weeks, well, she didn't fall fast, but she fell deeply. She wanted someone who saw her, and she believed he did. She didn't know then that city lights are often only reflections on puddles. Levi Weeks was born into timber and sawdust, the younger brother of a man who built houses like they were puzzles only he could solve. Born in 1776 in Massachusetts, the year the colonies declared their independence, Levi's childhood was shaped by hammer strikes and the smell of pine shavings curling to the ground. His father was a carpenter before him, a man of stern discipline and long hours. And there was little softness in Levi's earliest years. He was expected to be useful, measured not by talk, but by skill. By age 12, he could identify wood types by smell alone. By 15, he had calluses that never left. But he was not cruel or gruff like some boys who grow up with tools instead of books. He was soft-spoken, with a polite bearing that made elders smile and made people underestimate the sharpness behind his silence. He had a clean face, kind eyes, and a habit of looking at people straight when he spoke. It was a manner that served him well. He moved to New York at the urging of his older brother, Ezra Weeks, who had made something of himself in the city, taking contracts to build new homes in a place that was still clawing its way out of colonial grime. Ezra had the brains for business, Levi had the hands to match. By the time he was 21, Levi was well employed, trusted, and known to be sober, steady, and discreet. He did not gamble. He did not drink more than custom allowed. He kept to himself, worked long hours, and lodged alone in boarding houses that were simple but respectable. By all accounts, he was the sort of man no one noticed unless they needed a chair mended or a wall framed. But there was something else, something quieter, in how he moved through the world, a charm that worked on certain people, especially women. Not flashy, not bold, but sincere. He never boasted. He never made promises in public. But in parlor corners, in half-lit rooms, in walks down narrow streets, he knew how to look and listen in a way that felt honest. The boarding house on Greenwich Street was quiet that December, its halls muffled by the creeping cold and the soft padding of carpet worn thin by years of modest footsteps. Behind its shuttered windows and neatly drawn curtains lived a mixture of tenants, the kind that cities collect, a widow who embroidered handkerchiefs by the window, a pair of sisters too quiet for their age, a watchmaker who said nothing and smiled too quickly, and in the front parlor, young Elma Sands, pretty, bright-eyed, and not long from the countryside. She was 21, unmarried, and, most whispered, far too trusting for New York. The city was changing then. The year was 1799, and the streets were lined with ruts of frozen mud, the harbor wind howling through alleyways and tearing at cloaks as men and women hurried home before the sky turned steel gray. Elma had arrived some months earlier, accompanied by her cousin Catherine Ring, who had found her a place in the respectable boarding house run by Mrs. Ring herself. It was no grand establishment, but it was clean, safe, and home to clerks, tradesmen, and the occasional apprentice of good character. Or so it was thought. He came not long after, Levi Weeks, a carpenter by trade, not wealthy but employed by his brother Ezra, a builder of solid reputation. Tall, fair, and mannered well enough to put the older tenants at ease, Levi had rented a room on the upper floor, nodding courteously to the women and offering to fetch water when the pump froze. He was not remarkable, not at first. But he was young, and Elma noticed. They began to speak in the parlor, at first casually, later with a closeness that drew glances. He would sit beside her, just close enough, just careful enough. She would listen with her chin tilted slightly, the way young women do when hope begins to bloom behind the eyes. Some of the house's older residents wondered at how often the two spoke and how late the parlor candle sometimes burned. But young people were allowed to talk. Were they not? And Mrs. Ring, though she watched, said nothing. Elma had confided, Catherine would later say, that Levi meant to marry her. She believed him. She had no reason not to. He had spoken of a church ceremony, perhaps on a Sunday evening when the streets were quieter and the pews less full. Elma, who had little family and fewer prospects, clung to that promise like a flame in winter. She had begun to smile more. She had told Catherine to expect news. She had even said, on the morning of December 22nd, that the time was near. That very night, she said, Levi would take her away, perhaps not to marry immediately, but certainly to begin the steps that would make it so. She dressed carefully that evening. Her gloves were mended. Her bonnet was tied with ribbon. She left the boarding house just after nightfall, telling no one where she was going. She was seen walking with Levi. That much is certain. The street was snowy, lit only by lanterns and a rising moon. And she never returned. In the days that followed, there was confusion. The boarding house remained silent. Some believed Elma had run off, though few thought it like her. Catherine grew uneasy. Her cousin had left her scarf behind, something she never did. She had said nothing of an elopement or a journey. She had simply vanished. The city was busy with holiday preparations, and for a time, her absence went unnoticed beyond those walls. But silence has a way of becoming louder with each passing day, and by the turn of the year, that silence had become unbearable. Catherine began to ask questions. So did others. The whispers began. Had Levi taken her somewhere? Had he brought her back? Why did he say so little? Why did he look away when asked? There was something grotesquely calm about the place where they found her, as if the earth itself had conspired to hide what it had seen. Lispenard's Meadow, in those days, was not part of the living city. It lay just north of the settled streets, a stretch of half-frozen marsh and tangled brush where boys dared each other to explore and where adults had little reason to go unless their errands took them down crooked, muddy lanes. The well at the center of the meadow was old, dug first to serve the workers who had quarried stone nearby and then abandoned as the city crept outward, but not far enough to civilize its edges. It was, in all ways, a place meant to be forgotten. And yet it was there, just as the century turned and the last cold breath of 1799 hung in the air, that Elma Sands was found. 2 boys had gone out looking for firewood, or so they later claimed, and when they peered over the icy rim of the old well, they saw something strange beneath the thin sheet of cracked ice, cloth, blue-gray, drifting slowly in the black water like a drowned bird. The constables came, then the neighbors, then the men with ropes and poles. It took hours to pull her up. She rose slowly, arms limp, hair frozen to her shoulders, her bonnet still tied beneath her chin. Her body was marked, not with the wounds of a fall, but with bruises that told a different story. There were signs she had been struck. Her throat was discolored. Her fingernails broken. And she had been in the water long enough that the cold had erased the finer details, but not the certainty of violence. It was murder. Everyone knew it before the coroner said a word. Word spread through the city faster than the frost. A young woman, known, liked, and thought to be engaged, vanished after walking with a man and was now dragged lifeless from a well. Elma's name filled parlors and taverns alike. But one name rose even quicker, Levi Weeks. It was whispered at first. Then said aloud. He was the last to be seen with her. He had spoken of marriage, some said. He had denied knowing where she'd gone, others claimed. He had come back that night calm, unbothered, and had said she had gone out alone. Why had he not looked for her? Why had he told different stories to different people? And why, when Catherine Ring wept and asked him plainly if he had harmed her cousin, had he gone pale and silent? The constables arrested him within a day of the body's discovery. He did not fight them. He went quietly, his coat still neatly buttoned, his hands tucked at his sides. At the jail, he swore he was innocent. He said he had walked Elma out that night, yes, but had left her near a shop and never seen her again. He denied ever making her promises. He denied any argument. He denied even thinking of marriage. But New York was no longer in the mood to listen to denials. The city's newspapers were already sharpening their ink. And the boarding house, once quiet, became a hive of testimony. Tenants remembered things they hadn't thought significant before, Elma weeping once, late at night, clutching a letter, Levi taking long walks alone, a muffled voice behind a closed door. Catherine, now openly furious, told anyone who asked that Elma had loved Levi, had expected to marry him, and had died because she believed him. In a city as small and fevered as New York, it took almost no time for the case to become spectacle. Here was a young woman, innocent, poor, betrayed. Here was a man, her suitor, respectable on the surface, but now ensnared in suspicion. And here, perhaps most importantly, was a legal drama that would test not only the facts of a murder but the balance of power in a country still shaping its justice system. For while Levi Weeks was just a carpenter, his brother Ezra was not. Ezra was wealthy, connected, and quietly terrified. And within days of the arrest, it became known that Levi Weeks would not face the gallows alone. He would be defended by two of the most famous men in the land, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. Bitter political rivals who had agreed, though no one understood why, to stand together in the defense of a carpenter accused of drowning a woman in a well. The weeks that followed the discovery of Elma's body were a study in whispers that grew teeth. The city of New York, still more village than metropolis, had never seen such a case, and as the first icy days of January 1800 passed, what had begun as quiet gossip in parlors became full-blooded fury in streets, papers, and courtrooms not yet built to contain it. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had a version of the night. Everyone knew someone who had lived at the boarding house or had seen Elma walking alone or had once bought furniture from Levi Weeks. The city, with its muddy streets and rattling carts and chimneys puffing black into the wind, had become a living courtroom before any judge ever sat down. Women feared for their daughters. Men guarded their reputations. The well at Lispenard's Meadow, once ignored, became a destination. People traveled just to peer into it, as if the dark water might speak. Boys threw stones at the Weeks brothers' house. Shopkeepers crossed the street to avoid them. And in the jail, Levi sat each day with his coat still neat and his hands folded, answering questions with practiced calm and never once admitting guilt. But even he knew what the air outside had become. New York wanted blood. And not just any blood, his. There was something unnatural about the defense team he had gathered. Ezra Weeks, desperate to save his brother, had spent money with the silent fury of a man who believed the world could be rebuilt with enough timber and coin. And so he hired them, Alexander Hamilton, the political architect still bristling from losing national power, and Aaron Burr, vice president in waiting and Hamilton's bitterest enemy. That the two men should stand side by side in defense of a carpenter was, to many, absurd. That they should do it while barely speaking to each other made it stranger still. But both had their reasons. Burr, ever the tactician, saw opportunity. Hamilton, perhaps, saw principle, or perhaps he simply disliked the scent of mob justice more than he disliked Burr. Together, they were brilliant, unpredictable, and feared. And as the days drew closer to trial, it became clear that this case would not be ordinary. It would be spectacle. The courtroom at City Hall was cleaned and reinforced. Extra benches were built. Spectators began lining up before dawn, and the newspapers published trial timetables as if they were theater listings, and still, beneath it all, the girl was dead. Her body buried, her name now passed from mouth to mouth like a tragic character from a play no one had asked to watch. Her cousin Catherine Ring had not forgiven. She walked the city with black gloves and did not lower her gaze. She reminded people what Elma had been, gentle, dutiful, hopeful, and she told anyone who doubted her that Elma had gone to meet Levi that night with dreams of marriage and had ended instead at the bottom of a frozen well. Other tenants of the boarding house were more cautious. Some were afraid. Some changed their recollections. Some said they'd heard nothing. Some said too much. And all of it would soon be tested, beneath the eye of Judge John Lansing, in the echoing court, with a jury already chosen and the city leaning inward to hear every word. By the time the trial officially opened, on a dark morning in early March, there was no one in New York who did not know the name Elma Sands. There was no one who had not chosen a side. The courtroom was packed to suffocation. Women clutched handkerchiefs. Men gripped canes and glared. And in the dock, Levi Weeks stood silent, pale, and strangely unreadable. Behind him sat Hamilton, with notes already written and eyes like sharpened glass. Next to him, Burr sat quiet, watching the room instead of the bench. The prosecution came armed with anger and memory. The defense came with law and presence. And outside, in the streets of a city barely 30 years old, people waited to hear how one girl's last walk had turned into the most scandalous trial New York had ever known. It began not with shouting, but with silence, the kind that fills a room when every person present is too afraid to breathe first. Judge John Lansing looked down at the packed courtroom and gavelled once, not to begin, but to remind those gathered that this was not a theater. And yet it was, in every way that mattered. From the moment the proceedings began, it was plain that this trial would not unfold like others. For 3 days and 3 nights, with barely a pause for rest, the city of New York held its breath while a dozen men were asked to look into the soul of Levi Weeks and decide whether he had lured a young woman to her death beneath the frozen sky. The room was heavy with heat from too many bodies and breathless expectation, and even before the witnesses were called, the weight of Elma's name seemed to echo in the rafters. The prosecution opened with quiet gravity. The district attorney, Cadwallader Colden, was not a man to raise his voice unless it mattered. He painted a picture that was both simple and dreadful. A carpenter's apprentice promises a young girl marriage, walks with her into the dark, and she is never seen alive again. He reminded the jury that Levi had lied, that his stories contradicted themselves, that he showed no grief when Elma vanished, that he returned to the boarding house the night she died as if nothing had happened. He said that Elma Sands had been deceived, then discarded, and finally murdered. Then the witnesses began. One by one, they rose, neighbors, tenants, servants. All pieces of a broken mosaic that would never quite fit together. Catherine Ring spoke first, her voice steady, her grief restrained like a blade drawn halfway. She said Elma had loved Levi, had trusted him, had believed herself betrothed. She described the way Elma dressed that night, how she had smoothed her skirt, tied her bonnet, said she was going to meet him in secret. And how she never came back. Other boarders followed. Some remembered seeing Levi and Elma leave the house together. Some claimed he returned alone. Some spoke of tears, of whispered arguments, of a ring promised and never shown. But under cross-examination, the certainty frayed. Hamilton, with his relentless logic, pressed each witness not just for memory but for precision. What time exactly? Who else was present? Could they swear it was Elma he had left with, and not someone else? The defense sought not to deny the facts but to destabilize their order, and then came the physical evidence, or rather, the disturbing lack of it. The body had been too long in the well. The wounds were unclear. The signs of struggle could have come from the fall. There were no witnesses to the act itself. No weapon. No confession. Only circumstance, suspicion, and silence. And into that vacuum Hamilton and Burr poured argument as precise and chilling as a winter draft through a cracked door. They reminded the jury that speculation was not proof, that tragedy was not guilt. They pointed to the poor condition of the well, to the possibility that Elma had gone there herself, distraught. They suggested, carefully, almost delicately, that she may have taken her own life. The city gasped at the thought, but the law requires doubt to be extinguished, not merely outrun. Throughout the trial, Levi Weeks sat motionless, a ghost among the living. His calmness, to some, seemed sinister. To others, merely frightened. He spoke when asked, denied all, showed little. Whether this was guilt or innocence hiding behind composure, no one could say. But it was Burr, with his slow, deliberate voice, who reminded the court that to condemn a man to death based on shadows was to hand injustice a cloak of law. And Hamilton, like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, carved apart the testimony with phrases so sharp the room flinched. The jury withdrew late at night, after 3 days without sleep for anyone involved. It was said that some of them looked sick, others dazed, one with tears in his eyes. No one left the courtroom. They waited, packed and sweating, until at last the foreman returned. The verdict came like a blow to the chest, not guilty. Gasps, then silence, then uproar. Some cried. Some shouted. Some fled the building as if fearing ghosts would follow. Levi Weeks rose, nodded once, and left the courtroom under guard. The trial was over. The city, for all its noise, had not found its justice, but the question hung heavier than ever. If not him, then who? And if him, then how had he slipped the noose? Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, slow and silent, covering the streets and the well and the grave of Elma Sands in a white so clean it looked like innocence itself. In the days that followed the verdict, New York felt different, though nothing had visibly changed. The same wind swept down the crooked streets. The same market stalls opened at dawn and closed at dusk. The same church bells rang on Sundays. But beneath it all, something had curdled. People no longer looked one another in the eye quite so readily. Conversations began and ended with hesitation. The sense that justice had not been done, that something had slipped through the cracks of the courtroom like cold air through loose bricks, stayed with the city like a low fever. Levi Weeks was a free man. No court could try him again. But freedom in law did not mean freedom in life. He could not return to the boarding house. His brother's influence no longer served as a shield but as a reminder. Every nail driven by Ezra's workers echoed the question, who pays for silence? At markets, women turned away from him. At churches, men crossed their arms more tightly when he passed. Children whispered his name with the same morbid fascination they reserved for graveyards and fire. Levi himself did not speak of Elma again. Not in public. Not even in defense. He packed what he could and left New York not long after the trial ended, vanishing westward into a country that was still stretching its limbs. Rumors placed him in Ohio, then Mississippi, then eventually in Natchez, where his skill as a builder found quiet use. Some said he found a wife there. Some said he never married. Some said he changed his name. Others insisted he looked over his shoulder every time a woman walked past him alone. There were whispers he built churches as penance, that he died a haunted man, that he left no children behind. But all of it remained in shadow, because the city that had condemned him without a conviction no longer wished to speak of him out loud. Levi Weeks became a living ghost, forgotten by those who wanted to move on, remembered only by those who refused to, but Elma did not vanish. Not truly. Her name lingered in the cracks of the cobblestones, in the footnotes of legal books, in the cold recollections of those who had seen the body pulled from the well. For years afterward, young women in boarding houses told the story in whispers, as a warning and a lament. A girl who trusted too much. A promise made under candlelight. A walk into the dark. A cry never heard. Her grave at the First Presbyterian churchyard became a place not of pilgrimage, but of discomfort. People passed it quickly. Some said they heard footsteps when none were there. Some said they saw a figure in a blue cloak on the edge of the meadow where the well had stood. And the well itself, that dark mouth into which she had disappeared, was eventually filled and built over, as if the city had grown tired of answering for what it had not prevented. As for the trial, it left its mark in stranger ways. Lawyers quoted it. Judges remembered it. The names Hamilton and Burr gained yet another chapter in their long dance of rivalry, though this one did not end in blood, at least, not yet. The case had drawn them together in uneasy alliance, but it had not softened their hatred. For years later, on a grassy slope in Weehawken, they would settle that hatred with pistols. And Hamilton would fall, and Burr would flee, and neither would ever speak again of the carpenter whose case had briefly bound them. It was as though the trial had been a rehearsal for a darker ending, and the city? It did what cities always do. It grew. It forgot. It buried the past under bricks and new roads and louder scandals. But sometimes, in winter, when the river froze and the lamps flickered low, someone would remember the name Elma Sands. Someone would wonder what truly happened that December night. Someone would stare into the still waters of a well or the dark pane of a window and imagine a girl in a bonnet and cloak, smiling at a man she believed she would marry, and stepping into the unknown. Time, that great rearranger of stories, did not solve the mystery of Elma Sands. It simply diluted it. In the years after her death, new buildings were raised on the streets where she had once walked, and strangers passed the spot where the well had swallowed her life without ever knowing her name. The boarding house where she had lived was sold and resold until its walls were gone, its staircases stripped of their creaks and secrets. The meadow became part of the city, paved over, fenced, forgotten. The air where she had drawn her last breath thickened with smoke from 100 chimneys. But the story, strange and uneven, persisted in places too quiet to be heard by everyone, tucked into letters. Spoken behind closed doors, or scratched in the corners of old court records, always hovering, never settled, there were those who tried to shape her legacy into something clean. Some said she was too trusting, too foolish, a girl unprepared for the duplicities of men. Others insisted she was a symbol, a cautionary tale for women to heed, a martyr to the slow cruelty of justice and the sharp knife of public opinion. But neither version felt quite right. The truth, like the well itself, was deeper and darker than people wished to admit. She was a young woman who had lived modestly, worked honestly, hoped fiercely. She wanted, perhaps too simply, what many want, to be chosen, to be loved. To be seen. That those desires led her to death was not her fault. That the man accused of killing her walked away did not mean she was wrong to believe in him. It only meant the world had yet to learn how to protect its daughters. And Levi Weeks? History gave him no peace. Though acquitted, he was not exonerated in the eyes of the public, and he lived the rest of his days in the flickering shadow of a girl's absence. In Natchez, he built with quiet industry, carving houses and chapels out of wood and silence. His name rarely appeared in print again, and he spoke little of the past. Some claimed he wore black on the anniversary of Elma's death. Some claimed he avoided wells for the rest of his life. But no testimony ever returned, no confession was ever made. He died with his story intact, whatever that story truly was. Not all truths make their way into words. The lawyers who defended him, giants of their age, moved on to greater headlines and darker fates. Hamilton's duel with Burr in 1804 became legend, a punctuation mark on a rivalry that had once, briefly, served a shared purpose in that flickering courtroom. Burr, the survivor, carried more than one kind of ghost with him into exile and obscurity. Neither man ever looked back publicly on the Weeks trial, as though the case had been a mirror they dared not face again. And so the mystery remained. Who killed Elma Sands? Was it Levi, guided by panic or pride or fear? Was it someone else entirely, hiding behind the convenience of scandal? Or was it, as some dared to wonder, an accident swallowed by misunderstanding and fear? The answer had vanished into the cold air of that December night, into the dark water of the well, into the folds of a cloak and the silence of the stars. No one alive now can know. The records lie still, the voices are stilled, and yet when one reads their words, the chill of that winter returns. It is a story of a girl who never made it to her wedding. A story of a man who walked free, but never far. A story of a city still learning how to weigh the value of a woman's life against the smooth assurances of men in suits and power. And most of all, it is a story that never really ends. Because every time a girl goes missing, every time a name is forgotten before it is cleared, every time silence wins over truth, Elma walks again, just once, through the dark, waiting to be heard.